Snow swept across the platform in restless sheets, whistling between warped boards and rattling the iron hinges of the station door. Amelia Whitlow stood alone near the edge, her carpetbag drooping from one hand, the frayed handle biting into her palm. Her gray prairie dress clung damp to her figure, the hem stained where slush had climbed, and the cold pricked at her cheeks until they burned raw. She told herself she had grown used to staring, to whispers, but here, where the wind carried every breath like a sharpened truth, she could not hide. A bench of men in heavy coats watched her, their conversation too low to be heard, but not so quiet that she could not feel its weight. One laughed with his shoulders, another spat into the snow. Amelia gripped the bag tighter. She had come with hope, clumsy and trembling though it was. A fiancé, promised in letters, was meant to collect her. They were to leave this station together, and begin a life where the emptiness of her womb and the roundness of her hips might not matter. Yet the hours had passed, the train had groaned and left, and the plank walls had grown more silent than graveyards. He had not come. It was not the first abandonment. Suitors had looked once and then looked away. A family too poor to carry her kept her as long as she could work, and sent her off when her dowry failed to appear. Her body had always been named first, her barrenness whispered next, as though her worth began and ended with flesh and failure. Standing in that snowbound station, Amelia felt the sum of every cruel syllable rise inside her, pressing against her ribs until she could scarcely breathe. Martha Boone stepped out from the warm interior of the depot, her shawl bright against the white world. She pretended surprise at finding Amelia still waiting. "He's not coming, child," Martha said, though Amelia was no child. "Word in town is he learned you couldn't give him airs. Best you board the next train back before night takes you." The words slid like knives disguised as kindness. Amelia's throat ached, but she only nodded. To protest would be to beg, and she had no dignity left to spend. Martha lingered long enough for the men on the bench to catch her smirk, before disappearing again into the glow of lanterns inside. Snow thickened. The sky lowered until the world became a single color, gray swallowing gray. Amelia closed her eyes. Perhaps if she remained still long enough, she could vanish into it, become no more remarkable than a drift piled against a wall. Yet even in her stillness, she felt the eyes. They carved her down, one cruel glance at a time. The sound came sudden and strange, a soft rhythm of steps over snow that carried neither hurry nor hesitation. The air shifted, like animals stilling in a forest when something larger moves through. Amelia turned, heart thudding. He emerged from the whiteness as though born of it, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a cloak of fur that glistened with ice. An Apache, unmistakably, his dark hair bound with a strip of leather, his face marked with lines that spoke of winters endured. Townsfolk stiffened at his approach. One man muttered a curse under his breath. Another rose half an inch before deciding against it. Amelia's breath snagged. He did not look at the others. His eyes found her, and the world narrowed until the snow seemed to pause midair. He stopped before her, the air around him carrying the warmth of firewood and distant smoke. His gaze was not pitying, not cruel, only steady, as though he had seen her long before this moment. "You are alone," he said, voice low, shaped more by mountains than by towns. She wanted to deny it, but the truth stood heavier than the carpetbag at her side. She whispered, "Yes." His head inclined slightly, a gesture both acknowledgement and decision. He reached, not for her bag, but for the silence that had wrapped her in shame. His words slipped into it, simple and unyielding. "You're my wife now." The station exhaled as though struck. Martha Boone's shadow flickered in the window, her mouth falling open. The men on the bench erupted with mutters, disbelief snapping like brittle twigs. Amelia froze. "Wife?" Her shame swelled into panic, then faltered against the steadiness of his tone. No laughter clung to it, no mockery, only a quiet claim spoken as though the snow itself had granted it. Her chest rose, the air too thin, her eyes burning with the weight of choice, whether to step back into the derision she knew, or forward into this unknown wilderness carved into a man. A gust swept through, lifting the fur at his shoulders, pulling her hair across her eyes. The cold bit deeper and she shivered, not only from weather but from the strangeness of feeling. For the first time in years, that someone had stepped toward her instead of away. The crowd waited. Murmurs sharpened into judgments, the word savage, hissed by Elias Crow as he leaned to spit again. Yet none stepped close. The Apache's presence was a wall they dared not breach, and Amelia stood on the sheltered side of it. She pressed her lips together. The shame that had once crushed her now tangled with something fierce, something alive. She whispered, almost to herself, why? For the first time, he let a hint of expression touch his features. A ghost of sorrow of knowing. Because no one should be left. The words struck through her like fire through frost. The station seemed to tilt, the judgment of onlookers trembling against something larger, something older than their whispers. Her heart, battered and heavy, startled as if remembering it could still move. Snow fell thicker, cloaking the world in white. And as the crowd shifted uneasily, Amelia realized her life had pivoted on the whisper of a stranger, one who had crossed the storm to stand before her. Whether it was salvation or folly, she could not yet name. But when he offered his hand, steady as the mountains, she did not step back. The gasps that rose around them were sharp as gunfire, but his whisper lingered above them all, a vow that both terrified and steadied her, words that would carry her from shame into a storm she could neither predict nor escape. The wind followed them up the slope, howling through naked branches and clawing at the hem of Amelia's dress. She stumbled more than once on the snowpack trail, her carpetbag dragging her arm down until Taza reached silently and took it from her. He carried it as though it weighed nothing, his stride sure even where the path disappeared beneath drifts. She had never walked beside a man who wasted no words, who did not fill the air with instruction or complaint. He only moved forward, and the storm itself seemed to make room for him. By the time they reached the cabin, Amelia's breath came ragged, her fingers stiff within her threadbare gloves. The building stood low against the hill, its roof heavy with snow, smoke curling from a crooked stone chimney. He pushed the door open with a broad shoulder, the hinges groaning like old bones, and ushered her inside. Heat struck her face first, then the glow of a fire whose flames licked high against a stone hearth. The room smelled of wood smoke, pelts, and something faintly sweet. Dried sage hung from a beam. She pressed her back to the door once it shut, her heart still galloping from the walk, from the stranger, from the words he had spoken at the station that had already begun to alter the shape of her life. He moved with quiet purpose, setting her bag near the wall, laying his cloak across a peg. Beneath it he wore a deerskin shirt stitched with sinew, worn at the edges but strong. His hands were scarred, not brutally, but with the kind of marks that spoke of long work, long winters. He stoked the fire with a thick log and motioned for her to sit on the bench near it. Amelia hesitated. Her body ached from cold, but shame burned hotter. She thought of the whispers. Too fat, too barren, too useless to be chosen. And here she was, chosen without being asked. She sat because her knees trembled, not because she knew what it meant. He brought her a tin cup filled with water drawn from a covered bucket, the surface still cool from the spring. She drank greedily before realizing how she must look, clutching it with both hands, lips wet, shoulders hunched. But he had already turned away, pulling down strips of dried venison, cutting them into a pan to warm by the fire. Silence filled the cabin, not heavy, not hostile, simply present. Amelia found herself watching him move. He did not stare at her, did not measure her with the glance of a buyer at auction, did not mark her body as others had. His gaze was fixed on the fire, the food, the small necessities of care. Something in that steadiness made her throat ache worse than cruelty ever had. The flames snapped, and she thought of her mother's voice long ago, telling her that in every storm a person must find the thing that holds steady. She had not realized until now how long she had been adrift. When he handed her the pan, the venison steaming, the smell rich and unfamiliar, her stomach knotted with hunger. She ate slowly, half out of fear she might seem greedy, half because she did not want the food to end. He ate only after she had begun, tearing his share with his teeth and chewing in silence. Her voice, when it came, surprised her. "You don't know me." His eyes lifted to her across the fire, calm, dark as river stone. "I saw enough." She shivered, though the room was warm. "Why would you claim me? At the station, you spoke as if—" She stopped, unable to finish, for the word wife felt too fragile, too large. He placed his cup down, hands folding loosely in his lap. No one should be left. The same words as before, yet fuller here in the hush of the cabin, layered with something she could not name. Memory, perhaps, or grief. She wanted to ask what he had lost, what ghosts pressed behind his stillness. But shame held her tongue. Instead, she whispered, "And if I am not what you think? If I am less?" His gaze did not flinch. The snow does not ask the tree to be river. Each holds what it can. Her breath caught, the weight of his words strange against years of mockery. She turned her face from him, pretending to watch the fire, yet tears slid hot and quick down her cheeks. She hated that he saw them, but when she risked a glance, he was looking only at the flames, giving her the dignity of silence. Hours slipped by, measured in the pop of sapwood, the sigh of wind against the shutters. At last he spread a blanket across the bench for her, and laid another on the floor near the hearth for himself. She opened her mouth to protest. How could she take the better place when it was not hers? But he had already turned, stretching out on the floor, one arm folded beneath his head. His presence filled the cabin even in stillness, a steadying weight against the storm pressing at the walls. Amelia lay awake long after, staring at the rafters where shadows from the fire leapt and twisted. Her body still trembled with fear, with disbelief. She had been left at the station to be forgotten. Yet now here she lay in warmth not her own, beside a man whose silence was heavier than judgment but gentler too. She did not know if safety lived here, but it was closer than she had felt in years. Sleep came fitful, broken by dreams of trains that left without her, of voices mocking, of snow swallowing her whole. Each time she woke, the fire burned on, and the dark shape of Taza Redhawk lay steady at its edge. When morning broke, pale light slipping between the shutters, Amelia rose to find her bag moved closer to the fire, her shoes drying nearby, her dress brushed of snow as if unseen hands had tended them in the night. A lump rose in her throat, unfamiliar and frightening. No man had ever guarded her things as though they mattered. Before she could speak, a knock, hard, insistent, struck the cabin door. She stiffened, heart jolting. Taza rose in one fluid motion, his expression carved from stone. Amelia clutched the edge of her blanket, terror fluttering in her chest. The voices outside were unmistakable, carrying through the wood, sharp with disdain. "She's in there with him." Martha Boone's cry pierced the cold morning. "Taken by a savage." The words sliced through the cabin sharper than the wind. Amelia's breath hitched, shame flooding back with brutal force. The fire crackled loud between them, but nothing in its warmth could soften the chill that gripped her as the storm beyond the walls found its way inside once more. The path into town cut through snowbanks that rose like white walls, narrowing the world until Amelia felt caged inside it. Her shawl was wrapped tight, the wool scratching at her neck, but it could not keep her from trembling. The sun shone hard on the drifts, dazzling, cruelly bright for all the darkness inside her. Each step she took sank deep, the crunch of ice beneath her boots echoing too loud, as if announcing her arrival before she even reached the boardwalk. Beside her, Taza walked with that same steady rhythm, unhurried, unbending. He did not reach for her hand or guide her by the elbow. He simply walked, and somehow his presence made it possible for her to go on. The town stirred like a disturbed hive when they appeared. Men leaned on posts, women paused with baskets in hand. Conversations faltered, then surged again in whispers sharper than wind. Amelia kept her gaze low, though she felt every eye mark the roundness of her figure, the plainness of her face, and the strangeness of the tall man beside her. The words slithered across the air. Barren. Fat cow. Savage's whore, as if meant to crush her spine, but she walked on, her pulse hammering so loud it nearly drowned them out. Outside the general store, a knot of townsfolk gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal. Amelia's steps faltered when she saw Martha Boone among them, her mouth pursed with relish, eyes bright with judgment. Martha leaned close to Elias Crow, the settler whose bitterness always found fuel in others' misfortune. His sneer deepened at the sight of Amelia, and he spat into the snow as though spitting on her very existence. Amelia's breath snagged. Her knees threatened to buckle, but before she could crumble, Taza's hand brushed lightly against her shoulder. Not grasping, not forcing, just enough to steady her. That small gesture held her upright, as if he had given her spine the strength it lacked. She lifted her head then, not in defiance but because to bow it now would mean being broken beyond repair. The store's door creaked open, and Reverend Josiah Hale stepped out, spectacles fogging from the sudden cold. He looked at Amelia with something like pity, though his lips parted as if words trembled there. He said nothing, only stood awkward, his silence the kind that shielded no one. The crowd swelled around him, hungry for a show. Elias Crow took it upon himself to provide one. "See here," he barked, his voice rough as gravel. "We warned her kind weren't wanted. And now she shames herself with this savage, parading him into town like we're blind to the insult." The murmurs surged, laughter sharp as knives. Amelia felt the heat of humiliation burn up her neck, threatening to spill tears she refused to shed. She opened her mouth, but no words formed. Her throat had been hollowed too long by shame. It was Martha who supplied the cruel reminder. Her promised man left because she can't give him children. What good's a woman who can't fill a cradle? And now she clings to one who don't even belong here. The words hit harder than the wind. Amelia reeled inside, her shame rekindled in front of everyone. The crowd's judgment was a weight pressing her into the snow. She wanted to run, to vanish into the hills, but she stood there, trembling, her eyes stinging with humiliation. A hush fell when an older woman, widow Mrs. Alcott, who kept mostly to herself, stepped forward. Her voice, though quiet, carried. Taza once carried his sister through a blizzard when she was wounded. Near froze himself saving her. He's not the kind to leave anyone to die. The crowd shifted, uneasy, their certainty rattled by the intrusion of memory. Amelia looked at Mrs. Alcott, startled by the unexpected defense. Something uncoiled faintly in her chest, a breath she hadn't known she held. Taza himself said nothing, his gaze level, his silence more unyielding than any shout. He seemed carved from the very earth beneath the snow, immovable, unashamed. Amelia clung to that image even as the whispers began again. Elias Crow was not silenced for long. His voice cracked like a whip. "A woman like her don't deserve a place among decent folk. And him, he's a danger. We'll drive them both out before this town forgets its pride." The promise in his tone was not idle. The men around him nodded, some with anger, some with the restless eagerness of those seeking excuse for violence. Amelia's stomach dropped, fear crawling icy down her spine. She realized then that this was no longer gossip. This was threat. The Reverend cleared his throat, perhaps to intervene, but his voice faltered into nothing. He adjusted his spectacles instead, stepping back into the shadow of his own doorway. Amelia's heart sank at his retreat, at the confirmation that no help would come from the voices that claimed morality. For a heartbeat, she wanted to flee back to the cabin, to bury herself beneath blankets and hide from the world that scorned her. But the thought of leaving Taza standing alone in the face of such venom struck her harder than fear itself. She had been left behind enough times to know its sting. She would not do the same to another. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she forced her chin to lift. Her voice came soft, halting, yet it carried just enough. Better barren and fat than hollow and cruel. The words shocked even her. They slipped free like sparks from a flint, and the air around her seemed to shift. A silence spread, wide and sharp. Elias Crow's face darkened, fury ignited by the audacity of her standing at all. Taza's hand did not move from her shoulder, yet Amelia felt the strength of mountains behind her now. Something within her straightened. She had spoken against the tide, and though fear still coiled tight inside her, it no longer ruled her completely. Elias leaned forward, his glare venomous. "You'll regret that tongue, girl. Mark me. We'll not let this stand. By nightfall, every man here'll know we can't abide your kind, or his." The crowd muttered agreement, some louder than others, their voices a storm gathering force. Amelia's brief flame of courage wavered under the threat. She swallowed hard, her pulse thudding like drums in her ears. Taza's gaze swept the assembly, cold as steel, silent as thunder before it breaks. For a moment, none dared step closer. His stillness was warning enough. But Amelia knew Elias Crow's words were not empty, and neither did the others. The promise of violence hung in the frosty air, as tangible as breath. When they turned to leave, whispers followed like knives at their backs. Amelia's shoulders ached with the weight of it, but she walked beside Taza without faltering. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and though shame still gnawed, it no longer chained her. Back in the hush of the path leading toward the hills, she dared a glance at the man beside her. His face was unreadable, his silence vast, yet she sensed something unspoken between them, an understanding forged in the cruel glare of others. The wind rose behind them, carrying Elias Crow's vow across the frozen air. "We'll drive him out before the week is done." Amelia shivered, not from the cold this time, but from the knowledge that judgment had sharpened into danger, and their shelter in the storm might not hold against what was coming. The storm returned with the darkness, pressing its weight against the cabin walls as if the night itself sought entry. Amelia sat near the fire, her hands clenched around a tin cup gone cold long ago, listening to the restless groan of the wind. Each gust rattled the shutters, each hiss of snow against the roof sounded like footsteps drawing nearer. Taza moved quietly, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes, his face a mask of patience carved from stone. He had spoken little since their return from town, but silence between them no longer felt empty. It throbbed with meaning, unspoken fears, and a fragile thread of trust that bound them in the fire's glow. Hoofbeats broke that fragile stillness, first faint, then multiplying, until the earth beneath the drift seemed to vibrate. Amelia rose, the cup slipping from her grip and clattering to the floor. Taza's gaze shifted to the door. He did not flinch, only set the knife aside and pulled his cloak around his shoulders. When the pounding came, fists striking the wood hard enough to shake it in its frame, Amelia's heart leapt to her throat. "She's in there!" A voice shouted, sharp with scorn. "Elias Crow." His words cut through the storm. "Bring her out now, or we'll take her from you." Amelia's knees weakened. The heat of the fire vanished, leaving her trembling in cold dread. The shame from the station and the jeers in town crashed back like a flood. She turned to Taza, her voice breaking. "They'll hurt you. They'll hurt us both." His eyes held hers, steady, unyielding. He placed a hand on her arm, grounding her, as though the whole world might break apart without that touch. "You are not alone." The door shuddered again beneath a heavy blow. Shouts rose outside, a chorus of threats carried by the storm. Amelia imagined the faces beyond, Elias sneering, Martha whispering venom, men clutching rifles with hands eager for excuse. Every cruel word ever thrown at her seemed to hang in the air with them, pressing down until she could scarcely breathe. But then something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was exhaustion from years of being trampled. Perhaps it was the fire's reflection in Taza's eyes, but the weight of shame cracked, leaving something sharper in its place. She drew in a breath and, though her voice shook, she said, "I will not be left again." The words startled even her. Taza's gaze deepened with something unreadable, approval, perhaps, or recognition. He turned and drew back the bar from the door. Amelia's heart thundered, yet she stepped beside him, clutching her shawl as if it were armor. When the door swung open, snow blasted inside, and with it the sight of torches burning against the night. Men stood in a jagged line, rifles slung, faces hard. Elias Crow at their front, his mouth curled in triumph. "Step aside, Red Hawk," he barked. "The girl belongs with decent folk." Amelia's fear flared, but anger burned hotter. She stepped forward, her voice rising before Taza could speak. "I belong to no one but myself." The words came out louder than she expected, cracking through the storm. For a moment, even the men wavered, as if stunned by the audacity of a woman they thought too meek to raise her eyes. Elias's sneer twisted. "You think you can shame us, girl? You're nothing but a burden he drags. Too fat, too barren, too worthless to make a wife." The words hit like blows, but she did not fall. Her hands trembled, her teeth clenched, yet her voice held. "Better barren and fat than hollow and cruel." A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shifted uneasily, their certainty rattled. Snow swirled between them like smoke before battle. Taza stepped forward then, cloak flaring in the wind, his presence filling the doorway like a wall of earth. He spoke low, each word a blade. "Go back. You shame only yourselves. Elias spat into the snow. Not till she's out from under you. He raised his rifle half an inch, enough to make the torches glint off its barrel. The men behind him stirred, emboldened. For a breath, time seemed to freeze. Amelia's pulse hammered, the night stretched taut as a wire. Then Elias surged forward, boots crunching over snow, rage twisting his face. The scuffle was swift, more storm than fight. Elias lunged, but Taza caught his wrist with iron grip, twisting until the rifle dropped useless into the drift. Others shouted, but none dared rush in as Taza's strength bore Elias down. The snow swallowed the struggle in muffled thuds, the torchlight dancing across straining limbs. Amelia stood frozen, breath ragged, until Elias collapsed in the snow, weaponless, his pride shattered more than his bones. Taza did not strike the final blow. He rose, chest heaving, and stepped back, letting Elias sprawl humiliated before his men. That restraint was more terrifying than violence. The crowd, so loud a moment before, faltered into uneasy silence. Amelia's voice broke it, trembling but clear. I will not be taken. I will not be left. Not again. Her words carried through the storm, weaving with the firelight and the sound of Elias groaning in the drift. A few men lowered their rifles, their eyes darting away. Others muttered but did not step forward. At last, Sheriff Amos Pike appeared from the shadows, drawn by the noise. His coat was dusted with snow, his face taut with conflict. He looked at Amelia, then at Taza, then at the men who had gathered like wolves. His voice came slow, heavy. Enough. Back to your homes. This ain't justice. It's ugliness. The men grumbled, but the sheriff's presence cut through their bravado. One by one they turned, torches dimming as the storm swallowed them. Elias, face bloodied, spat curses as he was dragged up by his allies, but his words scattered weak against the wind. The silence that followed rang louder than their threats. Amelia sagged against the doorframe, her knees near buckling, the firelight behind her flickering against her pale face. Taza stood close, not touching her, yet his presence steadied her more than any embrace could have. She had faced them. She had spoken. The shame that once chained her had cracked open into something fierce, something alive. But even as the storm began to ease, she knew this was not the end. The judgment had not died. It had only retreated, waiting for another night. She turned to Taza, her lips parting to thank him, but the words dissolved. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not triumph but something older, heavier. A sorrow carried from long before she had stepped off that train. The fire behind them sputtered, the storm howled once more, and Amelia realized that while she had claimed her voice tonight, the war for their place in this world was only beginning. And in the silence that followed, Elias Crow's vow echoed in her mind, sharper than the cold. This isn't finished. The storm broke with a brittle dawn, the sky stretched pale as bone above the valley. Snow glittered across rooftops, masking the ugliness that had taken root the night before. Amelia stood at the cabin window, fingers pressed against the frosted glass, watching the faint curl of smoke rise from the town below. Every nerve inside her quivered with the certainty that it was not over. The silence outside was not peace, it was the waiting breath before a strike. Behind her, Taza tightened the leather strap around his knife, his movements methodical, unhurried. He had spoken little since the confrontation, but his silence no longer unnerved her. It steadied her, as if he were an oak planted deep enough to outlast any storm. She envied that stillness even as fear coiled inside her chest. When the knock came, sharp and deliberate, she flinched. Taza opened the door to Sheriff Amos Pike, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The man's face was weary, his eyes shadowed. "There's talk," he said, voice low. "Crows stirred up the town again. Says you've shamed them all, taking her as your wife without word or witness. They mean to make a public end of it." Amelia's stomach turned to ice. She had thought last night's fire would be enough to scatter them, but gossip burned hotter than torches. She looked at Taza, and though his expression did not change, his hand brushed lightly against hers, a silent reminder that she would not face it alone. By noon, the square was alive with voices. Townsfolk clustered near the church steps, their breath clouding in the brittle air. Amelia walked among them with her shawl drawn tight, every whisper piercing her skin. At her side, Taza moved like a shadow, each step calm, though men shifted uneasily when his presence passed. Elias Crow stood at the center, his arm bandaged from the night before, his pride sharper than his wounds. He raised his voice so all could hear. "We cannot allow this insult. She's not fit for a husband among us, and he don't belong to our kind at all. This so-called union is a stain, and it ends today." A murmur of agreement rose. Amelia felt her knees weaken, but she refused to bow. Shame had broken her too often, but something stronger now smoldered inside. She stepped forward, her voice clear though her heart thundered. "I was left to die in the snow. He chose me when no one else would. If that is shame, then let it be mine, and I will carry it gladly." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For once, the whispers did not drown her. She heard her own voice as if it came from a woman she had longed to be, but never believed she could become. Elias's face darkened. "You speak of choice? He trapped you, girl. You're blind if you can't see it." He sneered toward Taza. "Savages take what they want. He'll discard you soon enough." The words stung, but before Amelia could answer, Taza stepped forward. He removed his cloak and, in a gesture as old as the hills, draped it across Amelia's shoulders before all the town. The fur settled heavy and warm, a symbol clearer than words. She was not his burden, nor his possession, but his chosen. A hush fell. Even Martha Boone's tongue stilled. The sight unsettled them more than defiance could, this quiet claim, given without boast or threat. Reverend Hale, who had lingered at the edge, cleared his throat. His voice trembled, but it carried. "Marriage is not made by gossip nor broken by scorn. If two souls stand together, before God and before each other, who are we to tear them apart?" His eyes darted nervously, yet the words stood, fragile but shining. For a moment, Amelia felt the crowd falter. Doubt rippled through them like cracks in ice. But Elias, unwilling to lose, lunged forward, his hand flashing to the pistol at his belt. Time seemed to slow. The gleam of steel, the gasp of the crowd, Amelia's breath caught sharp in her chest. Taza moved before thought, his arm striking with the force of thunder. The pistol clattered into the snow, Elias sprawling after it. In a heartbeat, the fight was over, the man pinned, his fury reduced to whimpers. Taza did not strike again. His restraint was fiercer than violence, and every man watching felt it. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Sheriff Pike stepped forward at last, his voice iron. "That's enough. This town's law won't be twisted by hate. They're man and wife in the eyes of the law, and I'll not hear another word against it." The crowd wavered. Some muttered, some turned away, others watched with quiet shame. Martha Boone clutched her shawl tighter, her mouth thin, but even she had no words left. One by one, they drifted apart, leaving the square empty, but for the falling snow. Amelia's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with the weight of what had nearly been. She looked at Taza, who still stood over Elias's discarded pistol, his chest rising slow and steady. Their eyes met, and in that silence something broke open between them. Not fear, not shame, but a fragile, dawning warmth. Her voice wavered, soft as a prayer. "You could have killed him." Taza's gaze did not shift. "That would give them reason. Dignity is stronger than blood." Amelia felt tears sting her eyes, not from grief but from the strange, fierce pride swelling in her chest. For the first time, she no longer saw herself through the eyes of others. She was not the woman abandoned at a station, nor the barren girl mocked by whispers. She was the woman standing in the square, wrapped in a cloak that declared her worthy. The snow thickened, soft flakes drifting through the hush. Around them the world seemed remade, the storm giving way to a fragile peace. Amelia reached for his hand, her fingers trembling, and he did not pull away. In that simple touch, her heart thawed. The years of rejection, the endless echoes of scorn, melted into something small compared to the steady warmth beside her. Whatever storms remained, she knew she would not face them alone. But as they turned to leave the square, Elias's voice carried faintly from the ground, bitter as poison. "This isn't finished." Amelia's grip on Taz's hand tightened. The fight was not over, she knew that now. Yet the shame that once bound her had burned away, replaced by a quiet fire she had never known she could carry. And in the snow's hush, as the crowd dispersed and the world held its breath, she felt for the first time that she had a place to stand, and a heart that had begun at last to warm.